Travis Damar. Today we're going to be doing some brewing, a special project that I'm working on. I'm working on a recipe from the Goodman of Paris, as translated. We're going to be doing a Powdered Hippocras. And the fun thing with this recipe is there's actually two different ways to interpret this. I haven't really figured out which one I prefer, so we're going to do both, and we'll see how they come out. So, making the Powdered Hippocras in this edition here, it is on page 196, and if you look in the Goodman of Paris original copy, it's on page 299 and 289. So, we're going to be looking at the recipe in a couple different parts here. I'm doing everything as old school as I possibly can, which means I'm doing it all by hand. I'm not using a spice grinder, which is not going to be fun because all I have is the brute force method. And then hopefully I can refine it a little bit more with the mortar and pestle. And then we got to mix it all together. Now the other thing with this recipe is that we're making this big batch with a whole lot of ingredients. And I mean a lot of ingredients, a lot of quantity, and then we're only using a ½ ounce. So the trick with this is that we have to be able to store all this because this stuff's expensive, it's not cheap. And what we want to do is be able to create this again in the future. So the way that this is written out with the proportions is almost like you're making this powder to have in case you want to make Hippocras. And that's one way of interpreting the recipe. The other way is that this is the complete recipe from beginning to end. And the reason there's a difference is because when we read the recipe, it doesn't say to boil the wine like we think of for Hippocras. Later on in the book, there's a couple of places where he does talk about boiling wine, heating it up, and then adding your spices to it. But in this particular recipe, he doesn't. So this recipe is to make powdered Hippocras, take a quarter of very fine cinnamon selected by tasting it, and ½ a quarter of fine flour cinnamon. So that is talking about our cinnamon sticks that we have here, and then we also have powdered cinnamon. We're going to be using both. So we have that portion ready to go. I've got a bowl here of cinnamon sticks, and I'll get some powdered cinnamon. An ounce of selected string ginger, fine and white. Here I have an ounce of ginger that is ready to be grated. I've got my handy dandy appropriately themed grater for us to be able to strain this in. And let's see, what else do we have? We have an ounce of grain paradise. I've got those right here. Now these are awfully small little seeds. These are not going to be fun to try and hammer down and grind. I think at the most I'm going to be able to hope for is to be able to break the outer shell. We'll see what happens with those. So after we do our grains of paradise, we're going to add a 1/6 of nutmeg and galangal together and bray them all together. So a 6, all the other measurements are like quarter, 6, and ounces. So it seems that we're talking about weight measurements, which is why this comes out to a bigger quantity. So with the nutmeg, I have some whole nutmeg here. But I didn't have enough whole nutmeg to do the entire recipe. So I had 1 ounce of whole nutmeg, and then I added 1 ounce of already commercially powdered nutmeg, because it's all that I had. So we'll grind up these nutmeg, add them to this, and that'll give us our full amount of nutmeg that we need. Our galangal, it's almost like a, kind of like a tree bark. If you take a look at those, it's kind of like mulch. So those we're going to have to hammer down and grind as best we can. After we've taken these, it says to bray them all together. That is to mix them all together, ground up, to make one big batch, and we'll use this bowl here for that. And then once we have our powder, the next part of the recipe is take a good ½ ounce of that finished powder. So all those spices added together, we're going to only use a ½ ounce. And then we're going to add that to 2/4 of sugar. So 2/4 right there is a ½ pound of sugar, which actually comes out to almost exactly 1 cup. So it actually makes it kind of easy to measure. And then we're going to mix them with a quart of wine by Paris measure. Now, he talks about by Paris measure in several other places. in Paris at the time, 1393 to 1395, when this manuscript was written, a Paris quart was about 2 of our quarts that we have today. So we're dealing with a half gallon of wine. So it's a lot of work to make a half gallon of wine. Now, in order to do this, what we're looking at is I've got this pot here with the lid. So this is going to be our cold mixture where we're not going to heat the wine up. We're going to mix all the spices. We're going to add it into that exactly as the recipe says, without doing any other things that's not mentioned directly in the recipe. Then we have this lovely piece. This is a fire clay pot. This is already filled with the half gallon of wine. And this is on a trivet. We're going to put that right on the fire. We're going to heat that up. I chose clay this time because the idea is that we're cooking this in a kitchen. Clay would be much more common in the kitchen. There are a lot of metal pots and pans as well, but we see a lot of pottery. And a lot of the iron cauldrons and things like we were used to using is more outdoor stuff that we've seen rather than the copper or tin that we usually see in kitchens. So I figured let's try doing the clay because it is period appropriate and it's something different. So it's going to react a little bit different. We'll see how this comes up to a boil. So we'll do our heated version in that. All right. So we have here is a cloth. This cloth is for me to put the spices in. I'm going to fold it over, pound them as much as I can before grinding them, before we put them in. And then we have our period 14th century French jug. Obviously this is not 14th century, it is modern, but it is in the style of many of the French pottery that we see for storage jugs. So this is what our Hippocras will go into when it's completed. Alright, so we're ready to start actually making our spices. So I'm going to take our bowl here. Now we have the already powdered cinnamon. So we're going to add that to our mixing bowl. We have, let's see here, let's pull out our nutmeg because I don't have very many whole nutmegs. Yep. So we'll add the already powdered nutmeg to that. I've got our ginger here, so we're just going to go ahead, we're going to grate this right in. Now this is fresh, it's not dried, so it should be pretty potent. The recipe just said, you know, strings of ginger, it didn't say powdered, so I didn't bother trying to do any powdered, even though modern was, that would be much easier. And you can see when it's fresh, this stuff, when it does come off, does kind of tend to be stringy, so I think we're on the right path here for the recipe. Got that in there. Alright, now we've got our nutmeg. This is a linen cloth. So we're going to take our nutmeg, fold this in, just folding this up so we don't lose any nutmeg out the sides, especially because it's not cheap. The nutmeg is they're round, so they want to roll on you. Once you get them smashed, they go pretty well. Let's see how that looks. So that actually came out pretty good there. You can see there's still big chunks, but we're getting there to smaller powder. So now I'm going to try the mortar and pestle. Now with the mortar and pestle you don't want to overload it, otherwise you have no room to spread things out as you're putting it through. kind of put my hand on top just a little bit because when it gets to a big chunk, sometimes it wants to kick up on the sides. Well, didn't come out too bad. Nice powder in there, not a lot of chunks. Now, typically you wouldn't be using a mortar and pestle like this. You would use a quern or a grinding stone. Basically, it's a round stone on bottom with a groove in it and a spout, and then you have another one on top that has a handle, and you turn it and grind it, and it shoves everything down into the chute as it goes, and you have your powder on the end. However, I don't have one yet. That's next on my shopping list. Alright, so there's our ginger, our cinnamon, our nutmeg, the powdered cinnamon anyway. So next we're going to do the galangale. This was like a tree bark. Now a lot of these spices are very light in weight, which is how we end up with these big quantities. And I went back and forth measuring between volume measurements versus weight measurements, and everything that I could see really indicated that these were weight measurements. So we end up with a lot of these spices. Fold the ends once again so I don't get any escapees. Use my trusty hammer. Wooden handle, but not very period stuff. Let's see how that came out. Really didn't do much. Kind of still dealing with chunks of bark that we had before. So, time for the mortar and pestle. Now I could cheat and do this the non-period way, and I could totally use a spice grinder because we have one, but that's not the point of the Brewers Guild that I'm in, and this recipe is something that I'm entering to be judged on period accuracy and creativeness. So as our galangale added, now we have our seeds of paradise, which are real small here. Doing this method at best, I'm just hoping to be able to crack these open a little bit so that when they're in the wine, it will seep through the outer skins of these and take the flavor. Usually when you're doing a Hippocras recipe that calls for boiling the wine, it certainly helps with releasing the flavor that way. So it did crack the outer sides, so you'll see that there's little flecks of white. Let's see if I can. So if you look in there, you'll see that there are little flecks of white, and that is where the seeds of paradise have actually cracked open. So, not truly making a powder, but best I can hope for in the situation I'm in with the tools I've got. Alright, so the last ingredient that we need to grind up, since we have to braid this all together, is our cinnamon sticks. So these ones here are modern cinnamon sticks. I didn't get anything that was too fancy because you wanted 4 ounces of this. That's like half a box of the big stuff. And cinnamon is not cheap these days. It really wasn't then back then either. Alright. Bark on this, the couple pieces that came off that I just put in the mortar and pestle here, it is grinding, but it's not really making a powder, but it's definitely breaking these down into much smaller pieces. So it's kind of odd that this recipe would call for powdered as well as the sticks. we're getting here is what looks like tree bark. So it's not too bad. So I'm going to take this. Alright, so at this point, all of our powder, such as we call it, has now been added to the bowl. I'm going to mix this all up. Remember that we're only using a small piece of this. We want to make sure that it's mixed thoroughly so that when we go to pull out the half ounce that we're going to use, that it's not overly levied towards one side or the other as far as flavor profile with the spices. So we got to mix them all in. Mixing pretty well, it's not bad, even though there's a lot of chunks in there. So if I had a proper grinding stone, it would be much more like a powder. But that's okay, because you know what? All of these are still going to impart their spices. So now we've mixed our powder together. That's what the powder looks like. Not very powder-like, but this is experimentation. This is why we do this. So I've got my powder. Now I need to find a half ounce of this. Got my handy-dandy food scale. I don't have a nice one with counterweights and everything, though that would be fun to try doing some of these with that. Alright, take my bowl here. Try to get this zeroed out. Use my spoon here. Looking for half an ounce. 0.5. And there we go. We have 0.5. So it's not a lot. Really using that much, but we made all of that, so there's a definite disproportion to what the recipe calls for. Now I'm not sure if that's because he only knew to write it down in that capacity as far as that quantity and then take out what you needed, or if it was because the goal, which is one way that we're interpreting this, is that you're making this powder to be used over and over, so once the powder is made, then you have it in supply to quickly make more Hippocras down the road by boiling the wine and adding to it later. That's one way to interpret this recipe. So we have our first half ounce. So we'll go ahead with this. Now we're going to start with our, what I'm calling the cold mix. We're just following the recipe as it's stated. We have our half ounce, we have our wine, and I have our 1 cup or half pound of sugar. Now, what wine are we using? For this, I'm using a Pinot Noir. Now, the reason for that is that at the time that the manuscript was written, 1393, 1395, within that era, the Duke of Burgundy was cutting down all of the Gamay. I think I said that right, Gamay grapevines, because he figured that they were inferior, and the more popular one that he wanted Burgundy to be known for was the popular Pinot Noir. So I figured Pinot Noir at that time period, right within 2 years of this manuscript being written, as being a popular wine, was a good choice for this. The manuscript also does mention in several places Grenache. The only problem is that I couldn't get any locally, so the Grenache that I can get locally is actually Spanish. It's Grenache, which is not quite the same. So I went with Pinot Noir. It's a very popular French wine. We know that it was at that time period because it's written within 2 years of this manuscript. So that's what we're using. It's a red wine. So following the recipe, it says we're going to take our 2 quarts sugar and mix them with a quart of wine, which is our 2 quarts here. So I'm going to take our sugar, mix that right in here, and take our spices, mix that in with it. And if we're strictly following the recipe, that's it. That's done. We're not supposed to cook it, do anything. I'm just going to stir it up a little bit here. Let these spices sit in it. It doesn't say anything about straining it, though I would highly recommend it. Use a linen cheesecloth to strain it out, which is probably what I'll do before submitting this for my paneling for the Brewers Guild. Smells really good, though, I have to say that. Out. So there we have our Powdered Hippocras from Goodman, made exactly the way that it says to in the book without deviating. Now we're going to deviate a little bit more. The idea with this is that, as I said before, this is a lot of powder to be making, and the way the recipe is you can interpret it that we're making the powder so that we have abundance in stock, so that whenever you want to have this Hippocras wine, this is the powdered mix that you go to just quickly add it to the wine. You just heat the wine up as you would any other Hippocras that we know from documentation. You heat the wine up, you add the sugar and the spice in, and there you go. You have your Hippocras. So if we look at it as a way of, this is our prep cook recipe rather than the entire recipe, that would be the next recipe we're going to try. So we have our fire clay pot. It's got our 2 quarts of the Pinot Noir in there. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to put it on the fire. We're going to bring it up to a boil. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to put this cloth over top of a container. We're going to put the spices in this cloth. And what we do is we strain the spices through. So the spices actually go in the cloth. We strain the wine through until it runs clear, and then we have our Hippocras. So that's what we're going to do next. Magic of video, our wine has actually come to an end boiling. Started overflowing like crazy. In the meantime, I took our ceramic pot with the cold brew and I put it into our French jug here with my very non-periods spout, but it'll work. So now what I'm doing is I'm tying on this linen here. This will keep the linen from getting wet and falling down into the pot. There we go. We have our sugar. Half ounce again. So we'll It does say that, note that the powder and the sugar mixed together is the Duke's powder. So this is not the Duke's powder because the sugar's not mixed in. I'm not doing that until right beforehand. Alright, so now we're going to take our boiling hot wine, which was bubbling over. Unfortunately, I didn't get to the camera in time to be able to show it actually boiling over, but it was pretty impressive, pretty frothy. Take the lid off that, nice and steaming hot. My totally non-period oven mitts, safety devices. Not the best pouring device, this pot is, but it does have a lip, so it does work a little bit. I just want to let this slowly go through. I don't want to try and dump all of it in right away. I want to dissolve the sugar and the powders together as it goes. Now being outdoors, I've got mosquitoes and black flies flying all over the place, and I've actually got a mosquito that landed in here, but the thing is, I've got our filter, so it's going to keep him right out. Extra protein, right? So we all know that kitchens in medieval times were no strangers to dealing with flies and other things like that. Rotate this, trying to get some more of the sugar as I put it through. Smells fabulous. I always think of Hippocras as something that I want in the fall or the cool evening, something to warm up your taste buds, warm up your throat a little bit. Definitely something that's very appropriate for the holidays, no matter where you are. So it still has a little ways to go as far as going down through the cloth there. Just let that go. Making sure those clumps I see are not clumps of sugar rather than just the cloth. But I'm not trying to force the stuff down through the cloth. I want gravity just to do its thing. So I don't want to push any of this down through that isn't supposed to. And sometimes the bottom of it where the liquid's going to go down gets so bunged up with all of your hard fixings and powders and stuff that you just want to splash it up on the sides a little bit so the liquid will go down through. Just so it's not going down through because of a clog, not because there's a problem with the liquid. And I'm just gently pulling the spices away from the bottom just to make sure there's room for liquid to go down through. Alright. I think it's time for us to rotate this. And this was another ceramic pot that I used for the cold brew. In between I put it in here, but this ceramic pot, while it didn't come with a lid, one of my mini kegs, has a lid perfect size for it. And this is made to be able to use in a modern oven, so I know that it's heat treated, which is why I felt safe using the fire clay pot, putting the hot stuff right in here. I'm trying to be as period as I can be with all of my cooking vessels today. Even this old twine here is made out of hemp. tease that back and forth. There we have, there's the back side. There's the front side. You can see all the spices and things that were held back. This happens when you strain it out. So it really doesn't sit on the spices very long using this method, which we think of as the traditional Hippocras method. It's not sitting in there and steeping in them. Alright, I'll put the lid on that, and that's the lid on this project. So, two different ways to interpret the same different recipe, different ways of looking at things, which always makes these projects fun. I have a whole bunch of this powder left over. I think I'm going to probably put this through a modern spice grinder and then put this in a jar and save it so that later this fall when I'm at another event I can go ahead and make some Hippocras real quick, because that was really quick and easy. It really wasn't that bad. Until next time.